very big tariff on India, 50% tariff, very high tariff.
Everybody in America loses because of what India is doing.
Increasing barriers and complicating transactions will not help.
Reporting that President Trump is likely to skip Quad Summit.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to our webinar on tariffs and tensions assessing India's America dilemma. I'm Lisa Singh, the CEO of the Australia-India Institute, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present and emerging. And before I introduce our expert panel, let me just set the scene. Trump's punitive tariffs on India have really exposed the fault lines in the hugely consequential US-India strategic partnership. And the economic friction is moving the geopolitical tectonic plates of the Indo-Pacific. And continuing with that profound earthquake metaphor, these tariffs have really shook the foundations of New Delhi's foreign policy calculus of asserting its strategic autonomy. By weaponizing economic ties, Trump has laid bare the economic asymmetry between US and India in that one is more dependent on the other. The relationship that has been carefully cultivated for the last quarter of a century has come undone with the America First economic nationalism of the current US administration. Will this be registered as a minor tremor on the geopolitical Richter scale or as a full-scale megathrust, one that fundamentally reshapes the boundary plates of partnerships in the region? That is, I swear, my last earthquake-related metaphor. But for us in Australia, watching this tenuous tariff saga unfolding between our strong ally and partner has been discomforting to watch because US and India do not exist in a vacuum. While Australia has come out relatively unscathed by the Liberation Day tariffs, these recent events have nevertheless highlighted the unpredictability of the new US pragmatism, even towards their closest partners. So to unpack this further, I have an expert panel that will help us understand what caused this to take place in the first instance and all of the various spillover effects thereafter. So firstly, Mr. John McCarthy OO is one of our Institute's Distinguished Fellows. He is a former Australian Ambassador to the United States and a former Australian High Commissioner to India, as well as an ambassador to 5 other nations, including Vietnam, Mexico, Thailand, Indonesia, and Japan. Mrs. Hasini Haider is the diplomatic editor at The Hindu, one of India's oldest and most respected national daily newspapers, who regularly writes on foreign policy issues, which is also a recipient of the prestigious Prem Bhatia Award. Dr. Michael Green is Professor and CEO at the United States Study Centre at University of Sydney and previously was Senior Vice President for Asia at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And he served on the National Security Council staff at the White House from 2001 to 2005 and as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. And Dr. Teesta Prakash is a research fellow at the Australia-India Institute and an expert on Indo-Pacific strategic affairs, specialising particularly in geoeconomics in India. Previously, she was an analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and she was also the inaugural Southeast Asia Research Associate at the Lowy Institute. So thank you all of you for joining us, our panelists today. I want to start by just asking all of you a little bit about the drivers and the reactions of what's just occurred, particularly, I think, how we should read this rupture. So Mike, are these Trump tariffs pressure or punishment for India's reliance on Russian oil imports, or are they a part of some other underlying reason for driving this sort of rupture?
Well, I thank you, Lisa, and it's great to be with you, and I really appreciate what the Institute does. It's an important contribution. Look, I spent almost 5 years on the NSC staff, and I was hired mainly because of my expertise on North Asia. But the biggest things I worked on were within India and the creation of the Quad and what we call next steps in strategic partnership, but the Peaceful Nuclear Cooperation Agreement and just the transformation of U.S.-India relations. And everyone who's worked on India in the U.S. is completely puzzled because there's no strategic or even domestic American political rationale for this rupture and for 50% tariffs on India. Ostensibly, it's because India continues to buy oil from Russia, but I don't think that's what explains this. China is doing far more than India to support Russia's war effort. And President Trump is preparing to have a summit with Xi Jinping in October and trying to make a big deal and backing away from tariffs on China. So I don't think that's the real reason. There were debates in past about India. There were India skeptics. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were famously skeptical of India as they sought China as a partner against the Soviet Union. Bill Clinton, when he was president, was interested in India, but the 1998 nuclear tests ended that. That debate is over in American foreign policy and has been since Bush, George W. Bush. India is a critical strategic partner. Ronald Reagan, in strategic planning, said, we want India to be powerful. Whether they're aligned with the US or not, we need India to be a powerful player in the system to maintain a favorable balance of power. There's no strategic logic to this. There's not very much domestic political logic. The right wing of MAGA, Stephen Miller in the White House, and people around the president, some of them have a negative view of India because of immigration. But for the most part, the Indian diaspora is incredibly important in American politics. When Prime Minister Modi came during the first Trump administration, he and President Trump went to Texas and had a Howdy Modi Day with 50,000 members of the diaspora community, really important politically. When I was in the White House at first, the Indian diaspora community, their main ask of the White House was, could Diwali please become a federal holiday? But by 2006, the India caucus in the US Congress was second only to the American Israel Political Action Committee, AIPAC. So the most important foreign policy diaspora caucus in the Congress. So there's no domestic political logic. I think all the signs are it comes down to Donald Trump's personal anger at Narendra Modi. Why? Because Donald Trump claims that he solved the India-Pakistan dispute early this year and that he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. And Islamabad skillfully played this. They got close to his family. They offered to nominate him for the Peace Prize. The Chief of Staff of the Army got into the White House. And when Modi was approached to do the same, he explained that he couldn't for obvious reasons in domestic Indian politics. And, these are all non-public discussions, but the indications are pretty strong this is personal, and therefore personal for Modi. For that reason, it's not structural. It could change next week. We'll talk about the geopolitics of it. But my experience working with the Ministry of External Affairs and the Indian government is they have very long memories. And so I think the damage, even if it's reversed in a week or two, will still, in some respects, continue, unfortunately.
Okay, well, let's see if John agrees with you on that. Is it about structural economic tensions, John, or is it more about these personal political priorities of Trump and Modi?
Look, I agree with, I think, the totality of what Michael said. I just add a couple of points. I suspect that initially when the first lot of tariffs, the first 25% was placed on India, it was Trump's general resentment towards any country that had a favorable trade balance with the United States, irrespective of American strategic interests. And look at what, for example, the 25% on India, very heavy tariffs and a lot of unpleasantness in relation to Japan, arguably, the United States' closest ally, certainly in the region, possibly anywhere. And equally sort of that kind of approach towards North Korea and even towards countries which, while not allied, are strategically very, very important to the United States, such as Vietnam. So it seemed to me it was a bout of economic nationalism that prompted that whole display by Trump in early April. The second 25%, could have been based on a number of factors. I think the ego factor is really very, very important, and I fully support what Michael said on that. The fact that he was having problems with Putin. He wanted to have a go at Modi. Modi had been very, very clear that the problem between India and Pakistan was a problem for India to sort out, not for third parties to sort out. Resentment of what is called the re-hyphenization of the Pakistan-India relationship, which inter alia involves the thought that other countries might mediate it, and they ought to see the relationship with India in terms of its relationship with Pakistan, and not as a very clear acknowledgement of India's place in the world itself. So all those factors, I think, played a part in Trump's resentment of Modi. The fact that India did not come to the party when he wanted them to, and then of course, the Indian reaction was severe when you had Field Marshal Munir, the Army Chief of Staff, invited to lunch with the American president. I mean, that never happens. That doesn't happen in the United States. And so suddenly, right after, you've had this issue in Kashmir, where a group of Indians were attacked and killed. There was an altercation involving loss of Indian planes. And then a few weeks later, you have the Pakistan Army Chief of Staff invited to lunch. I think the resentment was much more severe with that sort of scenario than we would have appreciated in Australia. I think Michael's point about where all this leaves the United States, I don't think the whole situation is going to be remedied quickly. I think there has been an acute element of distrust brought into the Indian-American relationship, which both sides, not in a totally fluent way, but both sides have, since about 2002, both sides have worked very, very hard on this relationship, partly, of course, as a counterbalance to China. I think a lot of that trust has gone, and it's going to take a very long time to put it back. Look, recently there was a piece written in Foreign Affairs by Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell, which suggested that there be a renewed relationship between India and the United States, involving even a treaty, not a NATO-type treaty, but a treaty relationship. I think that must have been drafted before all this happened, and then sort of tightened up a bit and printed. That sort of scenario for the United States and India, I don't think is on the cards, certainly in the immediate or medium term. So I think that's really where it leaves us. Where it will leave the United States and India in terms of their future trade relationship is anybody's guess. I mean, as I understand it, Trump has suggested that the trade negotiations restart, but at the same time, there has been a suggestion that the Europeans should impose 100% tariffs on China and India. Who knows? I think the last 6 months of 6 or 7 months have caused us all to sort of really sort of throw up our hands and wonder what's going to happen in the United States. I don't think I can add very much to that. It's up to our other speakers now. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Well, I think John's raised some really good points there in terms of the singling out, and so has Mike, on not making sense, basically. Tista, how do you see that singling out for special punishment of Trump on India? Much of the world, including China, we know buys Russian oil. How are the geoeconomics of this playing out right now for India and the US?
Thanks, Lisa. I think, as I suspect, the problem isn't with the purchasing of the Russian oil. It is to do with the reselling of the Russian oil. And that's sort of seen as a backdoor sort of support to Moscow's war. And I think overall, though, there's this sort of crisis element, and the earthquake metaphor you mentioned. To me, as a historian, I feel most comfortable around when there is these crisis events, because as a Cold War historian, we must remember that the US-India relationship has been one that's been forged in crisis, and that's the title of the book of that Rudra Chaudhary wrote. He's a very famous US-India historian. And so it's been a turbulent relationship, right? This is not the first crisis that this relationship has seen. The Seventh Fleet of the US was parked in the Bay of Bengal in 1971. When the War of Liberation of Bangladesh was happening, so when Pakistan was splitting into two. So this relationship has seen a lot darker sort of times. And given that sort of turbulent past, because the last 25 years, as John pointed out, have been so good for the relationship, that this hiccup is now seeming sort of even bigger than it may be. However, the elephant doesn't forget. And this is sort of in that sort of vein. There is this sort of underlying, the Russian oil kind of is a metaphor almost to sort of highlight that maybe the US, or at least the Trump administration in its second coming, doesn't see India as a part of that big strategic architecture that the US itself built as a strategic valued partner anymore. It sees China perhaps as a bigger, more influential partner. And therefore, this sort of move of tariffs, or it's really just it's a way of showing that, well, you're no longer a primary sort of priority. Now things can sort of change on a dime with this administration, so I'm not going to put my money where my mouth is at all. But there's this underlying sort of current that's showing that there's a strategy and there's a personalism, and of course the personalism is playing out a lot louder. But given the fact that there is an institutional architecture that the US has really built, nurtured to serve its own interests, and the Trump administration doesn't value that architecture anymore. It's very clear. And India was a very valued part of that architecture, for trade, for balancing China, what have you, for various things. But it's clear that that is no longer seen the same way as the previous sort of administrations did, than to what the sort of the Trump administration sort of sees. So I don't know if I answered your question, but history kind of shows us that there is light at the end of this tunnel, but the next 3 years might not be as hopeful as we might like it to be.
Well, thank you, Tista. I mean, I think all of you have really highlighted the personal factor at play here. And Sahasini, you've been writing about this and speaking about this as a journalist in India. This personal factor, like, how is that sort of playing out domestically in India? What's the domestic reaction been? Also, not just from the public, but also from opposition parties in India. And how do you see the personal factor sort of, causing irreparable damage for the US-India relationship in that sense?
Well, Lisa, and thank you to you and the Australia-India Institute for organizing this at such a timely moment, because frankly, every morning we wake up and there's the next installment of this ongoing drama. The truth is that both Michael and John have quite rightly expressed a kind of, an inability to understand what is happening in Washington, what caused this kind of very extreme actions against India. But let's be clear, it is not rationality that is deciding geopolitics today. We have an entire international sphere, especially the big geopolitical powers, the US, Russia, China, all behaving in extremely irrational and unilateral behavior. The international rule of law, the international world order, these are all seem to have become, bits of history, really. I don't know if it's a permanent omission from our lexicon. So how is India reacting? The truth is, and all these have already been mentioned in some truth or form, there are 5 theories floating around in Delhi because, this is played out in everybody's face, literally. In February, we saw the 2 leaders together. They seem to have a very good conversation, albeit a little awkward on the issue of trade, where Mr. Trump was, haranguing India about its high tariffs at that time. And then they agreed to announce a free trade dialogue. India was a first mover there. So it looked like it was all, we were going to get ahead of the curve because it was even before Mr. Trump had announced his plans for reciprocal tariffs. And then you see that kind of deteriorate over the next 4 or 5 months. So it's a very small time period to have such a large deterioration in ties. And as I said, there are 5 theories being given out there. The first, as you said, is just about Mr. Trump's focus on tariffs being very high, and not just Indian tariffs being high, but some of the concerns we've heard over the past from the West, but also, in the Australia Free Trade Agreement, for example, India's market access restrictions on agriculture, on dairy, the US upset about genetically modified foods as well. So those are part of that concern, apart from the high tariffs. The second is this about Russia? And how can it be about Russia if China is not facing the same kind of tariffs? Although Mr. Trump has now suggested that the European Union should tariff China as well. The third question is really, is it to do with Operation Sindoor and the Nobel Prize and some of the things Michael and John and Tista spoke about, and the idea that Mr. Trump countered India's narrative quite clearly by first announcing the ceasefire long before, well, at least half an hour before India had a chance to announce it, and then taking credit for it, and then saying he would also mediate on Kashmir, which, as you know, a very sensitive issue, and went on to have Mr. Rubio say the 2 sides will now meet and discuss their other issues. So this really countered the Indian narrative, which was that Operation Sindoor had resulted in an unequivocal victory for India, that Pakistan was down on its knees, it had begged for a ceasefire, and India had accepted the demand for a ceasefire, but actually had continued the operation until all terror ended. So this really countered India's narrative. And then Mr. Trump felt that India's denial of his words countered his narrative and his possible path to a Nobel Peace Prize, because just as he has with, in the Cambodia, Thailand issue, in the Congo, Rwanda issue, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, he has put India, Pakistan into that list of conflicts that he has directly mediated in and fixed. So that's 3. The fourth is geopolitics. Are we looking at a larger frame in which Mr. Trump essentially is talking about spheres of influence? So if the US wants to take over Greenland, Canada, the Gulf of Mexico be renamed, it is more flexible on the issue of Russia's sort of hold over parts of Ukraine, and is not necessarily countering China on the Taiwan question right now, not really welcoming Taiwanese leaders to the US right now. Is India then not such a big part of his grand plan? Have we dropped off? Is the Indo-Pacific strategy now not so important? So there's the geopolitical question. And then finally, there's your question, which is it personal? Have they rubbed each other up the wrong way? Remember, while Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi were really close in his first term, from 2017 to 2020, and we saw them address 2 public rallies together, in the interim period when Mr. Trump was out of power, Mr. Modi went to the US 3 times, never once spoke to Mr. Trump. And we understand from the Trump camp that didn't go down very well. Mr. Trump even announced at one point, my friend Modi is coming to town, he's going to meet me. And that meeting never happened. Did that play over? Did the trade stuff play over? Did some of this Nobel Peace Prize stuff play over? And then it became a personal thing between the 2. What we know for a fact is that a conversation between the 2 men on June the 17th didn't go down very well. They obviously had a difference of opinion, perhaps because Mr. Trump wanted Mr. Modi to come to Washington and sit across the table from the Pakistani Field Marshal, General Munir. Perhaps because Mr. Modi did not accept Mr. Trump's view on mediating the conflict, didn't endorse it. What we do know is Mr. Modi came out with a pretty tough statement, or at least the Ministry of External Affairs came out with a pretty tough statement. Mr. Trump, who tweets about absolutely every conversation or truths about every conversation, never once put a readout of his conversation with Mr. Modi. So we do know that personal trouble began there, and it seemed to have gotten worse until in the last 4 days, it has suddenly gotten better. The two men haven't yet spoken to each other directly, but in a very sort of sweet way are tagging each other in comments that are very positive on the India-US relationship. So there's a lot of hope once again on that.
So Hasani, you really highlighted the irrational behaviour that means that could play out in all sorts of ways going forward. And I have to say that MEA statement was a tough one. I don't think I've ever seen MEA come out with such a tough statement. Before we go deeper into this sort of geopolitical challenge that our region is facing out of this position of Trump on India, I do want to ask about, what this does mean in terms of what Australia can learn from this. John, Australia has, such a strong, obviously, relationship with the US going back through an alliance for many, many decades. But at the same time, we are looking to secure a full free trade agreement with India. So is there any lessons for us here?
Well, I think the lesson for us is to prepare for the unexpected. Now, that point is most relevant, I think, in relation to our economic relations with the United States right now. But I don't think we should, unless the negotiations between India and the United States somehow loosen up the system, I don't think we should expect any great changes on the part of Indian trade policy towards us. Look, Modi was very, very tough on the whole question of accession to the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Even though there were some very strong security reasons for India to join that grouping. It's always historically been very, very tough on WTO issues. I wouldn't expect it to loosen up on agricultural issues, particularly, on issues with Australia, particularly agricultural issues, given the importance of that agricultural sector to Modi politically. So I wouldn't see too much optimism that we will find a way forward on the bilateral trade agreement because of these developments. I mean, it might, in due course, we might be able to get there, but I suspect it will be quite a long and quite a difficult haul, irrespective of what happens. Look, there's a sort of broader question than just the economic question, and that is where we sit because of this rupture between the United States and India. Look, the whole question of Australia's much, much closer relationship with India since basically the beginning of this century. A very low point was 1998, the nuclear tests. From then on in, there was a certain recovery, and the relationship is really a good one now. That has a lot to do with the fact that in security terms, we were, I think, caught up very much in the American slipstream as the United States got closer to India with the nuclear deal and so on. And Australia's approach on nuclear issues changed over that period also. So I think, that was quite an important factor. Even Indians sometimes thought that the Americans had encouraged us in that direction. They hadn't particularly, but nonetheless, it was important. The question arises if things go rather bad or don't get any better between India and the United States, whether that will impact our relationship. My inclination is to say, no, I don't think it will. I think we've come a long way in 25 years. We have a number of factors which bind us together with India now. My sense is that if the relationship between India and the United States stays bad, the Indians, rather than sort of pushing us aside, will be much more inclined, I think, to improve their relationships with, I wouldn't say like-minded countries in the region, but at least countries which have a fair bit in common with India. And that will be Japan, Korea, ourselves, and to some degree the ASEANs. So I think, I don't think there will be necessarily a negative impact on us specifically in terms of our bilateral relationships.
All right. Well, obviously, Tista, in terms of what John said, we also, like the United States, have, a growing Indian diaspora here. India and the US still have the bonds of their Indian diaspora, amongst other things, throughout all of this tumultuous part of the relationship playing out. But is the sort of unpredictability of Trump a worry for us in Australia in terms of our Indian diaspora? Or, we've obviously come out pretty unscathed from the US from the tariffs to date. So how do you see this playing out for us here?
I think on the sociological front, given the fact that the Indian diaspora is now the fastest growing diaspora within Australia, and the recent protests we've seen where Indian migrants have been singled out, given their large numbers, the tone that the US sets, right, even the MAGA movement, it does set a very sort of anti-immigrant tone. I'm not saying that the US culture is completely prevalent across the world and Australia just copies that, but it does send into motion sort of not a domino effect, but certainly some kind of mimicking where sort of migrants are seen through a negative light. And that is something that we really need to sort of build resilience towards within Australia. It was a little bit disheartening to see that most of the politicians only came out after the deed was done, not before. And that was no doubt noted in New Delhi, as was raised by the Indian High Commissioner in Canberra. So there is that sort of, if we are looking at the diaspora as an economic instrument, which also has its negatives. But if we are doing that, then we certainly need to tread with caution and ensure that their safety, psychosocial well-being is protected. And that's, it's economic, but as well as it's social. But I think more speaking in terms of just economic regionalism, this is a cause for worry because, for example, IPEF, which is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which includes Australia and India and sort of a bunch of Southeast Asian states, partially created during the Biden administration because India wasn't able to participate in RCEP, as John mentioned. Now, IPEF is now going to be seen with a lot more suspicion, right? So US and India don't operate in a vacuum, neither does Australia and India. We operate in this region, which has conflicting narratives of the ASEAN centrality, the Indo-Pacific, Asia and the Pacific, and all these sort of different nomenclatures. Now, IPEF specifically was seen as this platform for rule setting, right? So sort of, of trade facilitation, supply chains, clean energy, all of these sort of key regional issues that were seen in mutual interests of Southeast Asia, of India, of the Pacific, of the US. Washington's commitment with these tariffs is now going to be questioned more so than ever before. And more importantly, I think the elephant in the room, sorry about harping on with the elephant metaphor, is China, right? Now, it gives a lot of leveraging power to China through its participation in RCEP or sort of, other groups like the CPTPP, in that countries are now going to move towards China, not for anything, but for the fact that it's more predictable. It's certainly more predictable than a Trump-led US. So with sort of, these tariffs, there is this weakening sort of partner incentives. Countries will no longer want to put in any kind of political capital in these, like I said, the architecture that the US was building in the Indo-Pacific. So with that architecture completely breaking down, doesn't matter if Trump, goes in 3 years or what, we don't know what's going to happen then. But it's going to be incredibly difficult to build these things up again. And, once trust is gone, it takes a lot of sort of work to rebuild it again. So, the long-term economic sort of regionalism is incredibly fractured with these sort of, tariff measures. on India, on Vietnam, on Cambodia. India is not the only sort of hurting party here. There's many sort of countries that run a very large current account sort of surplus with the US. So there's this regional kind of frustration and irritation with this unpredictable sort of tariff regime that is going to be affecting the US and India and Australia sort of together. So it's a cause of concern. Even if this fixes itself in the next tweet or X post or Truth Social post, it's going to be it's going to take a lot of sort of hard work to really fix the long-term sort of game.
Absolutely. And Sahasini, seeing it from India, that where this goes, the hard work that Teesta talked about that's going to be required, do you see that Australia is in a good space for India to build closer trade ties at this time? Or do you think India might look more inward at economic reform at home?
Well, certainly it seems as if the government has had to do some rethinking. And the idea of the GST, the goods and services taxes, what they call reform, which is basically a backtracking on the large number of GST tax brackets they had put, was a way of saying that they feel the need to boost consumption internally because of the proposed sort of hit to exports. Now, if the 50% tariffs by the US continue, at least for the next 6 months, estimates are as much as $35 billion to be lost in export orders that are cancelled. Some have suggested or predicted a 0.5% to 1% shaving off of the GDP. These are serious numbers. And already, over the weekend, I was speaking to businessmen who said that they are already shutting down units, laying off workers, because export orders are a long-term proposition. So when you get hit by a 50% tariff, those export orders go into an immediate freeze for the next round. And to bring those orders back will take time, even if they were able to have a trade deal tomorrow. Those will take a little while to come back. There's going to be a disruption. So there's no question that the Indian government is going to have to deal with that. The second part of it is really the reputational stuff. And that has to do with Russian oil. Look, at the end of the day, everyone makes the point. India did not import Russian oil before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It was less than 1% or less than 2%. Today, it is 40% of India's intake. It's coming down. Maybe it's about 30%. But what the US has asked for in terms of bringing it down substantially or even zeroing out Russian imports is going to be very difficult for the government to sell to the people, because we've had 3 months of a kind of almost, hyper-nationalistic anger against the US for having demanded that India stop Russian oil. It's going to be very difficult for a government to backtrack now. And even if market forces require India to zero out imports of Russian oil, it's going to take quite a lot for any government to agree to it. We do know for a fact that in the latest negotiations, the US has once again pushed that they would like to see those numbers go down. The European Union's sanctions against a particular Indian entity, which is nearly 50% owned by Rosneft, the Russian oil major. The rest of the 49% is also owned in certain amounts by Russian companies. So sanctions against that particular company has already put the freeze on the intake that company is taking in. The public sector undertakings are already, de-risking a little bit by cutting down Russian oil imports because of the pressure that's gone on shippers, on insurers, and all the rest. But the truth is, for India to zero out would really be a huge climb down for the Modi government. That is itself, this is not, and I don't mean it in a pejorative term, this is not Europe. That can accept this kind of climb down when it came to their trade agreement and accept the kind of tariffs despite the investment they put in. Japan has seen a government fall because of the sense that they gave too much to the US And that was not good enough to forge a deal. And so you can imagine that to a factor of a few more for a government like the government of Narendra Modi that sees itself as the alpha, certainly in the region. And finally, I would say that there is a precedent. In 2017, 2018, Donald Trump insisted that India zero out all imports of Iranian oil and subsequently Venezuelan oil. Iranian oil was 12% of India's intake. It was cheaper crude, it was sweeter crude, much better for our refineries, and came from right next door. And yet the US push on sanctions forced India or forced the Modi government to back down. Having done that, then they were forced to take away Venezuelan oil as well. That's not an experience that they would like to repeat easily. Because then again, we saw 6 months of the government really, working up the hyper-nationalism, editorials written across, sort of saying India must stand strong, stand up to this bully in the US. Only to find 6 months later, the government said it had no choice but to zero out the oil. Now, Russia is not Iran. To lose not just the oil supply from Russia, which, as I said, is replaceable. India is already buying more from West African countries and of course, West Asia. But the reputational damage, both domestically and in the eyes of India's relationship with Russia. India's positioning at the SCO last week, where Prime Minister Modi, the axis of defiance, if you like, that was there with President Putin and President Xi. The BRICS with Brazil, even though Mr. Modi didn't attend that himself, Mr. Jaishankar did. The truth is, it would hit India's image and possibly the government's ego a lot more. So I see that as a bigger stumbling block. I think in terms of trade, it possibly would be easier. And I should make the point that once we do have trade negotiations with the US move, particularly on these tough issues like agriculture, dairy, and all the rest, then the conversation with Australia, with New Zealand, the European Union becomes that much easier.
Yeah, that's very true. All right. Well, Mike, what about this? So I saw in The Economist this week that it wrote that Trump's tariffs have been dealt a legal setback and face a Supreme Court test. How do you see that decision playing out for Trump and his tariff regime?
Well, the legality of IEPA, these International Emergency Power Acts he's using, is questionable, but the politics are even more questionable. These tariffs are quite unpopular in the US. And so I think to make sense of this rupture, we have to separate, I'm going to sound like a professor now, but we have to separate agency from structure, leadership from everything else. And, Donald Trump has done, through his own actions, more damage to US-India relations than any president in the last 30 years. Although Obama did some damage. I mean, in the first year of the Obama administration, Richard Holbrooke was assigned as a special envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And to get Pakistan's support, he promised to mediate on Kashmir. And shortly after that in Beijing, President Obama and Hu Jintao put out a statement saying they would work together on South Asia. So there were some big problems. But this is bigger. And the personal trust, I think, is going to be extremely difficult to repair. But we also have to look at everything else. And so you mentioned tariffs. The US job numbers are not good and indicate that we may be in recession. And there are two main reasons. And both of them are the irritants with India: tariffs and immigration policy. And so it's not just a Supreme Court case. The politics of the tariffs and the unpredictability and the immigration crackdown are hurting job growth in the US, which is Donald Trump's biggest vulnerability going into the congressional elections, the midterm elections. So that's a structural factor where to keep these 50% tariffs is going to be costly for Trump. It's not just the Supreme Court. And, China is predictable, yes, and the US right now under Trump is not. But remember, a predictable thing that China does is build the string of pearls, militarize the Himalayan plateau, cut off water, overcapacity. 30% of China's economic growth is from exports. It's a huge amount. and massive overcapacity. So that's not changing. And so all it takes is another Daklan-like crisis, and the anger at Trump looks a little different. So I think there is a floor to this. Rupture may be the wrong word, in fact, because the strategic importance of the US and India to each other has not changed. And even something like, there's been a lot of commentary about Prime Minister Modi attending the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I don't know, so Hasina and others may disagree, but I'm pretty certain that he was going to go no matter what. That was part of India's strategy to have its own version of stabilization with China. The tone was different. So I think, just last thought for me on this, it's not just that Australia will survive this, because I think that's right. I think Australia actually has an opportunity, if the government decides to, with Japan, to put a little bit more of a floor under the US-India relationship, but really to get the Quad going. I think a Quad summit is unlikely for all the reasons we've said. But Rubio, the Secretary of State, really wants to do the Quad. The Defense Department wants to do the Quad. India was poised in this next Quad summit to do more on maritime security. I think that's an agenda that could be picked up by Penny Wong, by Marles, by Rubio. Japan-India relations are extremely strong. It's the only bilateral relationship India has in the Quad that hasn't been interrupted. It's been on a steady upward trajectory for 20 years. So I think not alone, but with Japan, there's an opportunity to sort of keep the Quad going at a foreign minister's level. Leaders will get back to it, but maybe right now it's better not to have the leaders meet, frankly. So I think the agenda that matters for Australia, that's in that unilateral area like the Quad, I think Australia will take Japan too, but I think has some opportunities to sort of not just survive, but actually get a little more traction on some of the geopolitics that I think would matter to Australian national interest.
Yeah, that's really interesting on the future of the Quad. I was just going to ask, we've got to get into this a bit more now, I think, in terms of those longer term implications. So Hasini, did you have something to add on that?
Just a two-finger to say, I actually think the Quad is still possible. In terms of what we've seen over the last 4 days, which means that the two leaders are going to speak pretty soon. The trade negotiations are going to restart. And by Mr. Modi's tweets that we've seen, it seems very clear that he's willing to put some of the hurt, the ego damage behind him to engage with Mr. Trump. Regardless of how popular or unpopular that is in the rest of the country, I think by November, India will be ready to host that summit. Japan, in any case, will need a few weeks to have a new leader. Australia, I presume, is on board with it. And there is the outlook that Mr. Trump will travel to the East for the APEC summit at the end of October, 1st November. A possibility of a meeting with Xi Jinping either there or in Beijing. Of course, the question is going to be, and from the beginning, we're discussing all the US, India, and Quad stuff, but from the beginning, it's been, what is the nature of the US-China relationship going to be, and what kind of impact that'll have on the Quad? So I'll leave that there.
Can I do a quick two-finger? I'm going to give you a scoop. In the leadership spill in Japan, it's not really clear who will replace Ishiba, but probably the leading candidate is Koizumi Shinjiro, the son of the former prime minister. Koizumi Shinjiro worked for me at CSIS in 2006 and 7 on India. And he was the key person for a US, Japan-India trilateral we put together to encourage Japan to support the peaceful nuclear deal. And he spent extensive time traveling in India. And so I think Japan could be a really helpful partner for Australia in getting us through this. Abe did it with the US and Duterte in the Philippines. In some ways, as an American, I'm pleading for help. But I do think Australia has agency, and Japan is a key partner in all of this.
So the future of the Quad, you heard it here first, could still be alive and well. I think that's a really good place for us to move, just to sort of finally look at, we've just seen this bromance of images of Putin and Modi and Xi at the recent SCO summit. Tista, what do you see? I mean, obviously there was a metaphor, I think, by Xi of the dragon and the elephant dancing. They, as Mike says, they were always going to be there anyway in terms of attendance. But was it really about sending a message to Washington? What do you see the future in terms of regional cooperation with BRICS and SCO, these new partners that Modi is finding more favor with?
I think the answer lies in multilateralism, which is sort of the core of Indian foreign policy. After sort of the non-alignment, it's now the multi-alignment era. And I don't certainly feel that it's an answer or they wanted to show something to Trump. It's always been the bedrock of India's foreign policy is to never put all your eggs in one basket. So I think as we pointed out earlier that Narendra Modi was always supposed to go to the SCO summit. And yes, it was sort of, a marked sort of, departure after sort of 7 years. But I mean, as much as I hate to be a party pooper, I do see some sort of similarities, and we were just discussing the Quad and its future. The Achilles heel of the Quad has always been economics, right? So the first Quad iteration that came after the tsunami in 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami, we saw Shinzo Abe go to India and do the confluence of the two oceans speech in the Indian Parliament in 2007. That was the birthplace of the Quad. That sort of died down right around the global financial crisis. And while I'm not saying that those two are related, but each country at that time looked inwards to protect its own economic interests, including Australia for that matter, because this was a time where Australia was increasing its relationship and trade ties with China. So that really sort of economically, we're kind of in the same zone as well, where there is sort of a global dip in the economics of the world. And so while I'm not saying that history repeats, but it certainly rhymes. So there is this sort of question that will that sort of, that push for India's multi-alignment, which basically pushes it to BRICS, to SCO, all of which Donald Trump is vociferously against, including sort of the BRICS version of, creating their own currency, even which Trump took as a personal affront again. These are sort of India's core principles that may not sit well with Trump. Again, it's very difficult to tell what may or may not sort of anger him at any time. So given sort of India's multi-alignment policy, it does look like the Quad will take sort of a backseat, to me at least. It may not be the top priority of the leaders at least. But I do hope, like I've always said, I'm a Quad optimist, and I hope to be proven wrong. But all sort of economic factors point towards sort of the slow dissipation that we saw in 2007, 2008 of Quad 1.0. And again, like I said, I would like to be proven wrong.
I hope so.
I mean, look, just adding to that, isn't it a natural consequence when a country like India feels, rightly or wrongly, that it has been badly dealt from the United States, to move in other directions of foreign policy, and it's consistent with multi-alignment and so on, that it will seek to emphasize to a greater degree than it might otherwise have its relationships within the BRICS, move a little bit closer to China, but let's not exaggerate that. There are still very, very important structural differences. And remember that Modi, although he was in China, but just before the Great Parade, he went back to India before the parade took place. There was no question about that. But they will move in different directions away from the closeness of the relationship with the United States. Politically, he has to. It's very, very difficult for him in current circumstances just to say, "Oh, everything's great again. Let's get back to where we were 6 months ago." So, I think you're going to see, to some degree, greater proximity with some of the global South aspirations, with BRICS aspirations, a gentler set of dealings with China, but certainly not back to what it was before. But certainly, it would be hard to see the repair job taking place which would put India in the same position with the United States as it was 6 months ago. And look, I'd just like to add one point to what Tisa made. I think it's a very important point for Australia, and it's this immigration issue. There are two points here, I think. The first is there is a certain amount of cross-infection between the Western democracies on attitudes towards migration. You can see it in the United States above all. You see it to a considerable degree in the United Kingdom and other parts of Europe, and you see it in Australia. So that point about a certain element of infection coming from the United States to moods in Australia, which could have impact on immigration, I think is an important one. The second point is we do have form in this area. We're now sort of moving into a new Australia, multicultural and so on. But Indians do have long memories. We had the White Australia policy until the 70s, and then there were student issues in 2009, 2010. These haven't been forgotten. And if we have a resurgence in a serious way of anti-immigration sentiment, as demonstrated in the streets of Australia and possibly against Indians, that will reawaken all those concerns in India. I think it's important to remember that.
Thank you, John. That's a really important point. And I mean, yes, we do have that history here. Unfortunately, in Australia, it does remind me of my father moving here in the 60s as a young migrant under the White Australia policy at the time. So, yes, it's not that long ago. I think that's a really interesting point to end on. I think we do need to go back to the fact that we've been talking a lot about the US-India relationship, but also the ramifications and how it's all going to play out and does play out here in Australia. We've had 25 years of America encouraging India to look west and to become a strategic partner and push back against China's hegemonic ambitions. And now we've seen the unraveling of that, even if we've seen tweets overnight, calling Trump calling Modi his great friend again. I think, to go back to my opening metaphor, after any earthquake that causes structural damage like the tariffs have, the first task is obviously to start rebuilding. I'm not sure if we're at the rebuilding point yet, but you've all made the point that trust has certainly been damaged, and it's going to take quite a lot to resolve it in terms of diplomatic solutions, economic solutions, for those tensions obviously to be resolved. So thank you all for joining and sharing your expertise today and your insights. Clearly, the complex challenges facing India and our region are not over. A big thank you also to our audience. Obviously, how these developments may reshape the broader Indo-Pacific remain to be seen, so there could be further webinars that the Institute will host in this space. A recording of this webinar, though, will be available soon on the Australia-India Institute's website, so please feel free to rewatch and share it with your networks. We look forward to continuing this dialogue, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.